Hey folks, welcome back. Tonight we're taking a slow drift into one of history's favorite bedtime mysteries, the lost city of Atlantis. So, go ahead, dim the lights, pull up a blanket, maybe have some tea that's probably gone a little too cold already. We're not here to find Atlantis tonight. We're just here to wander through its story, very slowly, very calmly, the way Plato might have liked if he'd known people would still be obsessing over this little fable 2,000 years later. So, Atlantis. You've probably heard of it. A mighty city, full of temples and wealth, so advanced that it supposedly rivaled the best civilizations of the ancient world. And then, poof, gone, swallowed up by the sea in one day and one night. Which, if you think about it, sounds less like geology and more like something a tired philosopher made up after one too many cups of wine. But let's not rush. The story begins with Plato. Yes, the philosopher with a bad habit of inventing allegories that his students pretended to understand. In two of his works, Timaeus and Critias, he casually drops the story of Atlantis. According to him, it was a mighty island nation beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is just the ancient way of saying past the Strait of Gibraltar. Out in the Atlantic somewhere, there was this great kingdom, rich, powerful, and, naturally, arrogant. Atlantis, Plato says, made the mistake of picking a fight with Athens, which, of course, was Plato's favorite city. You can probably see where this is going. The noble Athenians, virtuous and heroic, managed to defeat Atlantis, despite being the underdogs. And right after that, nature stepped in. The gods punished Atlantis with earthquakes and floods, and the entire island sank beneath the sea. Moral of the story? Don't get too big for your sandals. Now, was Plato describing a real place? Or was this just a convenient parable about pride and downfall? Most historians lean toward the second option. Atlantis was less a travel guide and more a bedtime warning about arrogance. But humanity, being what it is, heard the story and immediately thought, cool, so where is it and how do we get there? For centuries, the story floated quietly in philosophical texts. Ancient writers didn't take it too seriously. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, didn't even bother mentioning it. He had enough trouble keeping his Persian wars straight. But then, as the medieval and Renaissance worlds rolled around, Atlantis started to look a lot more interesting. See, medieval mapmakers were not exactly known for accuracy. If you look at one of their world maps, you'll find Jerusalem in the middle, monsters on the edges, and a lot of blank space that basically said, "Here be dragons." Atlantis slipped neatly into those empty spaces. Some monks scribbled little islands into the Atlantic, sometimes labeled with vague names, almost as if to say, we don't know what's out there, but hey, maybe it's Atlantis. Then, in 1492, Columbus sailed west and stumbled into what we now call the Americas. And suddenly, the Atlantis story seemed a lot less ridiculous. If there was land beyond the sea after all, maybe Plato wasn't just making things up. Europeans arriving in the New World began to whisper that perhaps they'd found the remnants of Atlantis. Of course, this involved ignoring the fact that millions of people were already living there, with civilizations far older than their ships. But as history shows us, Europeans were very good at pretending they'd discovered something simply because they showed up late to the party. By the Renaissance, Atlantis fever was in full swing. Scholars, explorers, even kings and queens wanted in on the mystery. The philosopher Francis Bacon wrote a whole book called The New Atlantis, which had almost nothing to do with Plato's story and everything to do with Bacon imagining a perfect society run by science. Basically, Atlantis had become a blank canvas. You could paint whatever dream or fear or pet theory you wanted onto it. And it didn't stop there. By the 19th century, Atlantis had been picked up by some rather enthusiastic characters. Ignatius Donnelly, an American congressman, wrote a bestseller in 1882 called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. In it, he argued that Atlantis wasn't just real, but that it was the original source of all human civilization. Egyptians, Mayans, Mesopotamians? Nope, all just cultural hand-downs from Atlantis. Donnelly even claimed Atlantis explained Noah's flood, because why not double down? His book was widely read, and people loved it. Never mind that archaeology didn't support a word of it. The idea was too romantic to let go. Atlantis, in Donnelly's hands, became the mother of all civilizations, a single advanced society that seeded the world with knowledge before sinking in watery tragedy. And then, as if the story wasn't already stretched thin, the 20th century brought Atlantis into the hands of mystics, psychics, and eventually alien enthusiasts. Edgar Cayce, an American psychic, claimed to have visions of Atlantis. According to him, it was full of futuristic technology, crystal energy, and, of course, a giant catastrophe. Cayce predicted Atlantis would rise again in the 1960s, which did not happen, unless you count Florida real estate, which is debatable. By the time the History Channel came along, Atlantis was basically a cultural meme. Documentaries claimed it was in the Caribbean, or maybe in the Sahara, or buried under Antarctica. Everyone had a theory, and none of them agreed. Atlantis had gone from being Plato's simple parable to a kind of historical Rorschach test. You see what you want to see. But perhaps the most charming thing about Atlantis is how it reflects our own human imagination. Every era reinvents it. In the Victorian era, it symbolized lost knowledge, the rise and fall of civilizations, and a mysterious moral universe where hubris had very literal consequences. Modern pop culture treats it as a playground for special effects and CGI cities, usually with way too much glowing crystal. Atlantis became the ideal lost city for whatever each generation wanted: a cautionary tale, a romantic dream, or a convenient setting for a documentary. But yet, despite all this speculation, there's a quiet charm in knowing Atlantis never has to be found, because if it were, it would lose its magic. The mystery is what matters. Plato's allegory has outlasted countless empires, outlived more kings than we can count, and inspired more ideas than a dozen history textbooks combined. So, was Atlantis real? Probably not, but that doesn't matter because it tells us more about ourselves than it ever could about geography. It's a mirror of human curiosity, ambition, and our endless desire for stories that are just out of reach. We want a lost paradise, an advanced civilization, proof that humans can build wonders and then watch them vanish. Atlantis fills that yearning, gently, patiently, like a lullaby whispered across the centuries. So, as we drift toward the end of this little bedtime journey, let's leave Atlantis where it belongs, somewhere beyond the Pillars of Hercules, just past the edge of imagination.